At issue this week, the Auditor General says not even she can figure out how much the ArriveCan app actually costs taxpayers. She says there has been a glaring disregard for the rules around contracts. The opposition wants answers.
This app was supposed to cost 80 grand, said the Prime Minister. Now it's at least 60 million, but we don't know for sure because of missing documents.
The government is promising them.
There are direct follow-ups, investigations ongoing right now, both internal and external, to ensure that as rules were evidently broken, there are consequences, there is an accountability for this.
How damaging is this report for the Liberals? Does it speak to a larger issue around procurement and outside consultants, something we've talked about before? Hello, I'm Rosemary Barton, Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, Althea Raj here for At Issue to break it all down. Good to see you all again. This does have sort of flashbacks to times we've talked about outside consultants in the past. This particular app happened, of course, during COVID, but we've since found out that this company has also received many other contracts and perhaps with some questions. Andrew, why don't you start us off here on what you make of how significant this is and what it tells you?
Well, we don't know what it tells us yet in detail, because even the Auditor General, as your piece off the top said, couldn't get to the bottom of what things cost, et cetera, because no records were kept of what the money was spent on, who signed off on it, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's a little too quick for people to jump and say, well, the problem here is because they used external consultants. The problem isn't that they used external consultants, it's that they had no competition, no oversight, no records, and there may well have been, we'll find out, rather too cozy relationship between some people on the inside and some people on the outside. That's not outside consultants, that's just either some combination of incompetence and graft.
Yeah.
It's distressing in particular to see the Conservatives basically parroting the NDP on this and saying you should be doing everything with unionized public servants. What you should be doing is following proper procedures. The larger question, it seems to me, is if this is the culture within certainly that agency, is it the culture more broadly? How widespread is this practice, for example, of these multi-layered bidding process where somebody just takes a cut off the top for introducing you to somebody else?
Yeah.
Is there similar lax controls and lax record keeping? That is certainly worth looking into, because certainly we found that this particular company, GC Strategies, was getting a whole lot of different business, not just this particular ArriveCan app. So wider questions should certainly be asked, but let's be careful and clever about how we ask them.
Yeah, it's potentially hundreds of millions of dollars, although the CBSA and other departments came back to us today and said, we don't exactly know how many because there's so much overlap. We'll try and get you a clear number. But just so people understand, that company was sort of the matchmaker, right, between the government and the IT companies that could do the work. Chantal.
And since it has had a variety of contracts, one has across a variety of departments, one has to assume that there were instances where work got done. Sure. Otherwise, wouldn't a department tell another department, stay away from these guys? They're not going to bring you what you're asking for.
Yeah.
But that being said, I mean, $80,000, that was the original estimate for the cost. Yeah. Everybody understands that things happen in IT, but not to the point of building a bill to 60 millions without anyone saying, wait a minute, what in the world is happening?
Yes.
So a couple of points. I am with Andrew on the notion that the public service should not be doing everything in-house. But what this tells me, I mean, this company basically was a go-between. Mm-hmm. They got the contract, they had a list of providers, people, they subcontracted the contract that they'd been subcontracted. Okay, fine. But it seems to me that over the years, there is no one left within the public service who can actually look at an estimate and say, this is reasonable. Yeah. And if we are flying blind in IT, I'm curious to know how many millions of dollars have gone out the window.
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of Pierre Poilievre's point too, Althea. Like, why is there no one in government who can either do the work or at least have a sense of what the work might cost? Mm-hmm.
Well, that speaks to even bigger problems about the public service. I don't know that we want to spend the next 50 minutes talking about how to reform the public service. But I agree. I think there's two things we need to separate. one, I think there are legitimate questions to be asked about who knew what, when, and what they did about it, because that to me is still not really clear about when the political side was told. And even just below the political side, when senior public servants were warned about this, because if it didn't trickle up to the top, then it makes you think that this was the norm. And to Andrew's point and Chantal's point, then that talks about larger questions and bigger problems that need to be investigated. I'm not sure that the records were not kept. I think we also need to be open to the possibility that the records were deleted. I also think back to the consultancy problem. You know, these two folks, or three folks originally, who started this company, they spoke to the Ottawa Business Journal, I think, several years back about how they came up with this idea for their company. And they said, you know, the government's contracting process is very onerous, and they're right about that. But that is something that the government can do something about. If you're a small company and you're just two people who are actually doing work, maybe it's not worth the trouble to go for a $10,000 contract or a $20,000 contract. But the government can do something about it. There's no reason why public servants are not keeping the list that GC Strategies was keeping to try to find suppliers to do the work. And the other question is, you know, should you be just hiring someone who's a matchmaker and then hiring, you know, 3 or 4 levels of subcontractors to do the work, and you're not verifying to make sure what's happening? There are way bigger questions to be asked. It feels like we've just kind of scratched the tip of the iceberg. And I want to say here that Andrew's colleague, Bill Curry, has done some fantastic work on this file for the past several years now.
Yeah, he's been on it long before the rest of us were. All props to him. But in terms of, like, the app was happening during COVID, everyone agrees, the government was scrambling, trying to figure things out. But how much of this does the government have to wear, Andrew? Whether they knew or not, or were involved or not, like, how much of it is about a political damage for the government? Yeah, well, I mean, we talked about this question of the culture. People, obviously, within that agency, within that department, either thought this was okay, or if it wasn't okay, thought they weren't going to get caught. Either way, that speaks to something wrong in the culture there, particularly when it's, you know, more than one person involved, when it's something as widespread as it seemingly was in this case. Well, who sets the culture? The person at the top does. That's why we have ministerial responsibility. It's not because ministers directly made the mistakes or committed the acts that are involved. It's because if they pay for it with their jobs, they're going to make it their business to know what's going on in their department and make sure that the culture is right rather than wrong. And clearly that didn't happen here. And I don't think they should be allowed to get away with saying, as they have on so many occasions in the past, well, it was just a few bad apples in the public service. We've got a whole lot of bad apples, it looks like to me. Chantal.
Well, if you believe that you can get away with having a project that started at $80,000 end up at $60 million, you're either not very clever, or else this is common practice, and we don't know that. I would say, you know, I understand LTS point that we shouldn't go into what's happening to the public service, but at some point we should go into what's happening to the public service. A succession of clerks of the Privy Council went through the top civil service job over the past decade, and these issues have been building up, and the performance of the public service has been going downhill in all kinds of ways. So yes, I agree with ministerial responsibility, but at some point, someone is going to have to answer for how do we fix this. Because if you can't deliver a passport, if you can produce apps for 60 million, and no one seems to know why this happens, go down the list. Well, then what in the world are you doing? And do we really expect a politician to be able to fix this unless the top levels of the civil service are doing something about it?
Last minute to you, Althea, if you can bring it back to the politics and whether you think there's an impact there.
Yeah, I'm not saying I don't want to talk about the public service.
No, me too. It's just it's another segment. I agree. Yeah.
To talk about the public service. But yeah, to bring it back to the government, I do agree with Andrew. The tone is set at the top. The reason that contracts get increased larger and larger, and you see this in provincial governments and municipal governments, is because they can add on to contracts, which is another thing they should disallow, and some things that we're seeing the government move on now. But I don't think it's enough. I don't think the answers the government has given it's enough. What bothers me is they don't even seem that angry about it. This is taxpayers' money. It's a sacred trust. And you hope that the people who are in charge, yes, it's the pandemic, and yes, things had to go out the door, but you're hoping that the people at the top set a tone and the expectation, and that trickles down. And clearly people are not afraid enough that they're doing things that are grossly improper.
Andrew, then Chantal, and then I got to go.
Yeah, one last point.
Yeah.
It's $60 million is a lot of money.
Yeah.
It is 1/1000th of just the cost overrun on one part of the national shipbuilding strategy, right? The 12 frigates are going to cost, the latest estimate is $84 billion. The original estimate was $26 billion. Yeah. We've got procurement problems much larger than this, but it starts, if you don't get after these relatively smaller ones, you're never going to deal with the larger ones.
Chantal.
2 points. I'm not going to use the numbers from the Phoenix pay system overrun and the calamity that it has been.
Yes.
But the scary part is if the government doesn't look concerned, I don't think it's because they are not scared of the hit that they're taking.
Yeah.
I think it's because they have no answers to provide.
Yeah.
And that's maybe worse.
Okay, I'm going to take a break. I'm really glad Andrew did that math so we didn't have to. When we come back, we're going to talk about Steven Guilbeault's now clarified remarks about roads.
We still have funds, obviously, to maintain and enhance our road network across the country.
He now says the government will, in fact, pay to build roads after suggesting it would not. Does this complicate an already difficult week for the Liberals, as we've been discussing? That's next. The Minister of the Environment is trying to clarify his comments after he said the federal government would no longer invest in new roads.
It's not what I said. This is it. Wait, I can read it back now. What I have said is that the solution to our transport challenge passed by many different things, including massive investment in public transit.
Steven Guilbeault admits he should have been more specific and says Ottawa would not back any large projects. So how will these comments be used against the Liberals? Let's bring everybody back. Chantal, Andrew, and Althea. Althea, I'm going to start with you. When you have to clarify multiple times and you end up with something that didn't sound anything like what you said at first, it's usually a bad sign. But is this damaging or just like a gaffe that Steven Guilbeault made?
Well, it's damaging for people who already are not prone to like Steven Guilbeault. So I don't really think that there is a huge damage there. All the premiers are jumping on it. People who are convinced that Steven Guilbeault is an environmental activist who's out of touch will latch on his comments to believe that he's an environmentalist who's out of touch. I do think that Mr. Guilbeault basically said the quiet part out loud. A lot of environmentalists, and it seems like many people around the cabinet table, believe that if you build more roads, you encourage more cars, and that the government should not be doing that. And instead, it should be investing in public transit. And I think that that's what he meant to say. His clarification about, I was really talking about le troisième lien. I wasn't in the room, so I'm not sure if that was the segue or not. But it does seem like a little bit of a stretch. By the way, he is not wrong to say that if you build more roads, it leads to more cars. That is true. But not everyone in this country lives in an urban area or even in an urban corridor. Yeah. And the idea that he's leaving is that, if there is, for example, some environmental catastrophe, the federal government wouldn't kick in to help rebuild roads, or that if there's a need, the government wouldn't. And that, again, speaks to the Liberals being out of touch for many Canadians.
Yeah,
although,
it really does.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
It really changes people's perspective.
It really doesn't help with the urban-rural thing that the Liberals are constantly having to deal with.
Okay.
Chantal,
There is a reason why this story never got picked up in French anywhere.
Go ahead.
I'm sitting about a couple of kilometers from the Champlain Bridge. It links Montreal to the South Shore. It was built by the Liberals. And he didn't say out loud what they really think. For 6 months, every single Quebec federal minister has been telling the Quebec government that they will not be funding the third link to Quebec City unless it has a public transit component.
Yes.
That is so not news that his biggest error was to not complete the sentence, possibly for having said it so often in French that it kind of became a given. That being said, before we go into this, he wants to force people in the countryside to take bicycles and walk kilometers, possibly with no shoes because they're... guess who pays for roads in this country? The majority of roads are financed by municipal and provincial governments.
Sure.
The federal government gets involved in major projects. the Confederation Bridge, the Champlain Bridge. But it is not the federal government that decides that they're going to give 2 lanes to Highway 50 between Ottawa and Montreal.
No, but you would agree that it's not a great thing for him to say.
I would agree that he never realized that he was saying what people are making him say. And that is the reason why it was such a non-story in a place where there are people, plenty of people who would have liked to write that Steven Guilbeault was depriving Quebec of a third link because he wanted everyone to not have access to highways, except that is not the reality of the policy of the government, which has been the same since 2015.
Andrew.
We have over 1 million kilometers of roads in Canada. To judge by the response, you'd think the minister had proposed to rip up all of them and we'd have no roads, because people are running around saying millions of Canadians won't be able to get to work or take their kids to school, as if he proposed to get rid of the roads. He's not. He's proposing to withdraw federal funding for new road construction. Well, first question any fiscal or constitutional conservative would be asking is, why do the feds need to be involved in road building at all? That is a quintessentially local or provincial matter. It's true that federal government,
the Trans-Canada Highway,
except for things like the Trans-Canada, but generally speaking, and the fact that federal governments have gotten themselves involved for political reasons over the years doesn't mean that they have to be in eternity. And he's also absolutely right to say, if you build a lot of roads, you don't fix congestion. By the way, building a lot of transit doesn't fix congestion either. You don't fix congestion until you get at the root cause of it, which is that we give away scarce road space for free. We don't charge to use the road, so instead we allocate them through time. That is to say, the people who get to use the roads are the people who are willing to sit in traffic for hours and hours every day. That's a really inefficient way to do it, but one of the consequences of that is anything you do to try to just quote unquote make the traffic move faster, build a lot of roads or build a lot of transit, all it does is reduce the time price of driving, and lo and behold, as every study confirms, people respond by driving more. So no, building new roads is not the answer to congestion. It may be the one that every politician prefers to talk about, but if you notice, none of it has actually reduced congestion.
Quickly, Althea, and a last tiny word to Chantal. Althea.
Andrew is right. Period.
Well, he said that. Now we have to just end the whole panel that you said that. Okay,
let's
Chantal.
Just preserve that tape, shall we?
Last word, Chantal.
I am with Andrew on this, but that being said, and again I say it, the federal government not only should not, but does not finance the majority of roads in this country. It's on the Government of Canada's website. It's called Journalism to Check.
We have to take a short break here, but when we return, we'll take a look at the leaked comments from a Liberal MP on Canada's response to the war in the Middle East. That's next. The Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs was recorded criticizing his government's decision to cut funding to a UN agency for Palestinian refugees.
I would have done it completely differently. I would have immediately said exactly the same money will flow to humanitarian assistance. We'll just find other ways to do it temporarily. Our government bungled that, and we should have announced it the same day.
Just the latest example of divisions inside Liberal caucus. The Prime Minister says the disagreements are a sign of diversity of views that happen across the country, but is it being managed well enough inside Liberal caucus? Let's bring everybody back. I mean, it might be being managed inside caucus. This call was leaked or shared with my colleague Evan Dyer, but Rob Oliphant was very blunt as a parliamentary secretary. I don't know what you made of it, Chantal, and whether you think that kind of thing needs to be whether there have to be consequences for that kind of thing.
I don't. I think there need to be consequences if you are participating in a discussion and you lose your end of the discussion and you go to a microphone and you start talking about it and you're the parliamentary secretary to the Foreign Affairs Minister. This isn't what happened. This is someone who taped a conversation with Rob Oliphant where he expressed the views that he certainly defended around the table. I've spoken to pro-Israel MPs who have been even more forceful in saying bad things about their government. The only difference is I didn't tape them without telling them, and I didn't put whatever they said on air. So I think it's relatively healthy to know that all points of views are being defended inside the government. Someone at the end of the day makes a decision. You cannot like it. I have my own opinion of it. But I think the last thing you want is to stifle debate.
Yeah.
And again, this is not an MP who went out and said, let's make myself a hero.
Yeah,
It's not his type anyways.
No, he didn't say the Prime Minister needs to go, how dare the government do this, any of that. I mean, I sort of think that Chantal's right there, Andrew, that you want to know that there's these fierce conversations happening on issues like this. I don't know.
Sure. I mean, I agree. First of all, as Chantal said, it was a private conversation, not a public conversation. Second of all, he's not a member of cabinet. Cabinet members have a duty of cabinet solidarity. Members of caucus do not. And we in the media all too often act as if they do. And we get all very excited because there are quote unquote divisions within a caucus, i.e. members of parliament acting like adults with brains who are representing their constituents or their consciences, all the things that, you know, usually we talk about we want more of, except when it actually happens, and then we get all excited and say, oh, look, they're divided.
Right.
Now, there are those who have sort of conspiracy theories who say, oh, the Liberals are orchestrating this so that they can be on both sides of the issue. I think that gives them far too much credit for coordination. I think the more serious charge is what comes out of cabinet is all too often straddling both sides of the issue in a way that I think winds up just confusing people and not being based on any sort of clear set of principles, but just kind of political calculations. That's a fair charge.
Yeah.
But frankly, I'm not entirely sure why this is a news story.
Althea.
I'm not sure what the question is, because I do agree. It's interesting that we kind of all agree. I think it's also because of the nature of our jobs, where we talk to people all the time who tell us things in confidence, and we hold those confidences, but they illuminate our thinking about what's going on in all those party caucuses. I don't think he said anything there that was that crazy. In fact, in the end, that is what the government decided to do. It just took few more days to get to that position. He does raise the interesting point about the fact that the government is giving money now to other agencies who on the ground will end up having to give the money to UNRWA or other UN workers. I'm not exactly sure what that will look like, but that does raise some interesting questions. As far as the two sides thing goes, I'm not sure that Canadians are not on side with the Liberals on that issue. You know, for a lot of Arab and Muslim Liberal MPs, it's very clear what should be done. And for a lot of MPs whose ridings have a significant number of that population pressuring them to do something and who feel helpless, it's completely understandable that they would have a different opinion than MPs who represent very Jewish areas or Jewish MPs who feel also very differently on both sides. But I do think that a lot of Canadians who don't feel personal attachment to this issue are kind of wondering how, you know, at once the hostages can be released and also that there isn't this humanitarian catastrophe where innocent people are being forced to pay a price. And so I think there is sensitivity to the government's argument on like trying to have it both sides and please nobody at the same time. I do wonder if maybe that's where most people who don't have an immediate connection to this conflict lie.
Last word, Chantal, then I gotta go.
Yeah, this isn't a soccer match where you want to pick the right side. It is possible to hold two thoughts in one's head. That what happened to Israel is something that it needs to fight back on. But that what is happening in Gaza is a humanitarian tragedy.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you all very much for your time. Appreciate it.